Good morning, everyone. Time for another video about our IXEG 737, and I think the hype and dare I say hysteria over Microsoft Flight Simulator has died down a little bit, and things have been put or have gotten some perspective. And while I don't have the new Microsoft Flight Simulator, I've seen lots and lots of footage, and it looks fantastic. Absolutely no doubt about that. But I think it's been established that for now at least, for serious airliner simulation, it's not the way to go. So I decided to fire up our 737 again, and we left off over London Heathrow, and actually we were in the Lambert holding pattern. And I said when I finished the last video that we are going to do an RNAV approach. We get lots of requests about RNAV approaches. Can the 737 do them? How do you fly them? And of course, I'd like to show you how that works. I have already set up the aircraft appropriately. The approach items and checklist is done. I've set the approach speeds. I have set the auto brake, and we are here early morning over the mouth of the River Thames, and you can see it's winding to London there in the background. Kind of hazy this morning, but still pretty good visibility, so you'll at least see something while we fly the RNAV approach. And of course, I have picked the appropriate approach, and you can also see here on my AVI tab that I have found an approach chart. It's a little dated. It goes back to September 13, but it is the RNAV approach for the runway 27 left. And you'll see lots and lots of information on this chart. Let's go over the most important part. You can see the plan view. The approach starts at nexa, and when you have an RNAV approach, you will always have like one waypoint that is preceding the final approach fix. You can see FAF, and the reason for that is you don't want to approach the final approach fix in LNAV, and then the FMS will cut the corner short. As you know it will smoothly intercept the inbound course, and of course there could be obstacles to the left or to the right of the approach path, so it's very important that you fly over the final approach fix on a straight line, so you don't stray left and right, and consequently would compromise your obstacle clearance. And here's the runway 27 left. That is the end waypoint of the approach. It's also the missed approach point, and if you zoom out a little bit, you can see the missed approach is conventional. Now most of these charts will have a recommended profile where you get distance to the runway, 7 miles, 6 miles, 5 miles, and so forth, and an appropriate altitude to be at, so you can cross-check your altitude while you fly the approach. And you can see the side view here, the vertical view. Nexa you will pass at 3,000 feet, then you can go down to 2,500, and then you can follow this virtual glide slope in the sky basically. And they also have a table here where it says rate of descent and an appropriate ground speed and an appropriate rate of descent, so you can put something into your vertical speed window that gives you a ballpark for coming down this glide slope. And it's important to pick out the right obstacle crossing altitude. This is basically the minimum, and you see you have two different options here. There's an LNAV VNAV and an LNAV only option, and the 737 Classic is not certified to fly the LNAV VNAV. You cannot fly the approach in VNAV. You'll have to fly it in LNAV and vertical speed. So for us, we're category C. The 560 is the minimum that we will fly to, and then there are a couple notes down here that are also of importance, but that I'm not going to go over now. And as you can see, I put the 560 on the minimum right here. Now we're approaching Lambourne. There's not a published transition here, so we're just going to give ourselves radar vectors. I'm going to turn, well, usually when you approach London Heathrow, they will, sometimes you get to fly the holding patterns, but often they say after Lambert, just fly heading 270 or so, and then we'll just go to that right now, and the plane goes to heading select, and we're flying heading 270. I'm going to expand the range a little bit so you can see over here is the airport, here's Nexa, here's the final approach fix, and I'm going to turn the plane to the left now, fly a sort of a downward, and then establish ourselves inbound to Nexa. And it's very important when you fly a GPS approach like that, an arnov approach like that, that you have the correct altimeter set. That is of vital importance, because there's no horizontal guidance except for your own altimeters. And if you set the altimeter setting wrong, then you will basically fly yourself into the ground in a worst case scenario, especially if the clouds are really, really low. So that's something that's important, and normally when we fly these in real life, you have to confirm the altimeter setting with the tower as you're on final approach, just as a safeguard to really make sure that you have it correct. So let's turn left and go to maybe heading 140, and at the same time we're going to start descending to the 3,000 feet mentioned on the approach chart, and that's the altitude that we will leave to start the final approach. Now I'm double checking if I have the correct altitudes here in my FMS, and it is 3,000 or above for Nexa and 2,500 or above, and then 139, which is 50 feet above aerodrome elevation for the threshold of runway 27 left. So that all looks good, because as we fly the approach, we're going to use the vertical deviation bar to help us guide on the virtual glide slope in the sky. This is the way to fly these RNAV approaches. You don't dive down to 560 feet and then fly low level over London until the runway comes in sight. Technically, that would be okay unless there's a step down altitude here depicted on the approach charts. You often have those as you cross high buildings, maybe over here, but here in London it's not the case. So technically you could go down and then fly level, but that's not the technique we use. We try to fly these pretty much just like an ILS approach, and you can see the recommended profile is the vertical path angle 3 degrees. That amounts to 5.24%, and that's 318 feet per nautical mile. So just a regular descent. Let's go down a little steeper. There's about 10 miles to go to Nexa. 10 miles, that's about 3,000 feet of altitude. So we can just hit level change and then start the descent a little more steep. Now, as we get into position to turn to Nexa, I'm going to put Nexa into the top line of the FMS and then just do a direct 2. I can actually start doing that now. And then I have, there's a little range, a little high. Let's look at it like this, and you can see here's the turn. And if I do the turn right now, then it will actually make me fly over Nexa at a pretty much the heading that I would need to fly afterwards. See, it's going to increase while I make the turn, but then I'm going to get established on the final course of 270, which is exactly the final course that I want to fly to the runway after the approach or the final approach fix. Now 10 miles to go. I'm at 7,000. That it's not going to be enough to reach 3,000 in time. So I'm going to pull the speed brake a little bit, help me down here. And one thing you do not want to do is when you fly an RNAV approach is come in high and hot. These are still not as, well, I would say, smooth and easy to fly as an ILS where everything is set up automatically for you. You do have to, plan a little bit ahead and stay ahead of your aircraft. I'm just setting the course and the heading back to 270 just as good practice. That's not relevant. We're not guiding with the course right now. We're flying this in map mode, and So this is really not anything that you have to do, but it's really good practice. So I like to do that and keep everything pointed ahead. Now the approach lights are on. You can see there's the Thames, there's London, and there's the airport already ahead, but we're pretending that we cannot see anything. So 5 miles to go to Nexa. We still need to lose 2,500. So we're coming in a little high. I'm going to help us here by extending flaps. We're going to 1. Oops, I bumped my autopilot, my joystick, and that disconnected the autopilot. So we're going down a little steeper. And I'm going to extend flaps to 5. The maximum speed for flaps 5 is 225, so we're still good. We're coming in at 210, but of course we want to slow down anyway. As we cross Nexa, we can descend further to 2,500 feet. That is the altitude that we want to leave the final approach fix at, and after that we're going to go to vertical speed. And I'm going to say it now. The crucial part about this is really, putting your MCP altitude away from the altitude that you're at, because otherwise you will not be able to engage vertical speed. And that's very frustrating because you get over your path, and that's just not something that we want to do. So I'll mention that again in a second when we get there, but really that's very, very important. So now we are going to slow down to 180 knots, which is appropriate for flaps 5. And you can see, or which is the maneuvering speed for flaps 5. And you can see we're coming up at 3,000 feet just before Nexa. And of course, after Nexa, we can go down to 2,500 feet. And that's what we'll do. So we're passing Nexa right here, and then we are going down to 2,500 feet. I also have unable cruise altitude. We can cancel this. I have the runway 27 left waypoint set up over here, so I can double check my distance as we, or my altitude as we approach the airport. But of course, over here on the top left side, there's also the distance to the runway. So now I'm at 2,500. Now that's what I said. We need to put this away to the missed approach altitude. And now you can see this altitude hold becomes, there's a light there. And that means we can go into another mode. And here we are just passing. So I'm just going to go down to maybe 800 feet. And now we are really going to watch the vertical deviation point. And we want to keep this centered, and this is like our virtual glide slope. And I can double check my ground speed right now is 170. And if I look over here, whoops, didn't want to do that. 160 would be 850. So you can see I need to go down a little further. Let's go to maybe 1000 until we're caught up over here. Now go down, gear down, and reduce speed to our final approach speed, which is 131. And of course, the arnov approach is something that you want to fly flaps 15 in autopilot. You don't want to fly this manually, and especially you would have to use the flight director. That means your co-pilot would have to keep dialing in the correct vertical speed. And while you just chase the flight director, that's not something that you want to do. It's mandatory to use the autopilot, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm getting out of the speed brake now, and we're coming up on our path, so I can relax a little bit on the vertical speed. Go to flaps 25 and flaps 30. That's the final setting. And then we can read the final checklist. Start switches continuous. Speed brake, armed green light, gear down 3 green, and flaps 30 green light. So now we're on the path. You can see that over here, tracking nicely. We're in LNAV. We're coming up at 1,000 feet, and maybe glance outside for a second. and it seems to work very well. 1000 is checked, so the plane is now established, and you see I don't even have the flight directors on. If I did, then now would be a good time to actually turn them off, because as we enter manual flight, we don't want the flight directors to give us wrong guidance. They would just guide, well, laterally probably okay, but it's not unusual to be a little bit offset on these approaches, a few meters. So, and especially they would just guide vertical speed, which is not what we may want. So we're now at 100 above. I'm going to gain manual control of the thrust levers, and
500.
Here comes the minimum, autopilot off, and manual flight. So that's pretty much all there's to it. It needs a little bit of preparation. You want to, know what's going to happen, not fall into the 2 or 3 traps, and especially you want to have the correct altimeter setting dialed in, because otherwise you may come in too high, or what's even worse, come in too low,
200.
and you don't want to do that. Of course, in Heathrow, they want you to fly 160 knots to 4 miles. We didn't do this now, but they're really adamant
100.
about that, and it's important to keep doing that.
40, 30, 20, 10.
Here we go, and reverse. And then, of course, they also like you to get off the runway fairly soon. So I'm going to stow the reverse, use manual braking. And this looks like a very convenient exit. So we are using the new London Heathrow I made for laminar research. It was added here in the 11.50 beta run, and of course I've flown to London Heathrow in real life more times than I can count, so I am fairly familiar with the airport and try to put as much detail and character into it as possible. And you can see right here it's using some of the old custom objects that came with the Aerosoft version that Aerosoft gave to laminar when I think Explain 10 actually came out. So I'm trying to I try to retain as many of these custom objects as possible. But of course, there's also a version out on the gateway. So some people reported that the custom buildings are giving them trouble with frame rate. So it's can always disable the Aerosoft hybrid version, as I call it, and just use the gateway version, which is, obviously not looking as detailed as this custom version, but it should also be sufficient. So I'm going to do the after landing items here, and I'll try not to run off the taxiway. It's always a little tough when you do this by yourself, but normally I would just slow down right now and stop, so I can do that without this, but since we only carry virtual passengers, it wouldn't be a total disaster to run a little bit into the grass. Now we're passing, coming up on Kilo, which is our usual parking spot is going into Kilo and then parking here on that terminal. So I'm slowing down a little bit for the turn. This one goes off, and of course we need to raise the flaps, because otherwise they get the sky marshals or the SAS here to meet us as we pull it to the stand, because that's like an old secret sign that if you keep your spoilers out and your flaps out, that something is wrong, and they would assume that maybe there's some sort of hijacking scenario going on or so. So here we're pulling in. There's a big construction site ahead that's also there in real life. I haven't been to London for a couple months. I'm not sure how far they got, but they're really tearing down a lot of the old terminals and putting in new ones. And there's, oh no, 218 is taken. That's my favorite spot. Well, we'll just go into the very corner here. So, I think I got everything done. And we'll just take 216 and pull in over here and get the plane parked. Morning sun reflecting off the building there. And of course there's no nose guidance stand. I put in a couple signs here so you can at least tell which spot you're on when you park, but I would say that's about far enough to go in. Let's look on the outside. Yeah, see, I could have gone a little further. Let's do that then. And there's good. Right there. Okay, and here we go. Of course, the special thing about England is they will not come to the airplane and attach a ground power until the rotating beacon is off. They're really, I would say, paranoid about it. It's not that way in every other country of the world, but they are. So you need to turn off the engines, and then once the engines have spooled down, you can turn off the anti-collision light, and then they would attach the ground power and you can get off the APU. But in these corona times, you're supposed to run the APU at all times anyway to give maximum ventilation to the passenger cabin. So we're doing that as well. So I hope you enjoyed this short flight and the arnov approach. If you have any questions, please write to me, and I'll try to get back to a more regular scheduling of my little video clips.